I'm going to take that as a yep. Let's do it. Let's see. 321, 321. There it is. Test, test, test. Volume is correct. All right. Here we go. It starts. 3, 2, 1.
I have
Current Geek! Current Geek!
Hello, party people, and welcome back to Current Geek. This is an autopilot edition of the show, a chance for us to watch the pilot episode of a TV show and geek out about it. I'm Scott Johnson. He's Tom Merritt, and this week we are talking about the Venerable Dick Van Dyke Show.
Oh my gosh, did I love this show growing up? And of course, I was too young to watch it when it aired, premiered on TV, but they ran it in reruns in the afternoons where I was growing up on the St. Louis television stations. And I adored this show. I had a crush on Mary Tyler Moore as a 8-year-old. Like this show has a very, very welcome spot in my memories of growing up.
I do too. I have very fond feelings for it, and my experience with it was exactly the same as yours. It was a show that was before my time, but it would be on Saturday afternoons or some sort of syndication when I was growing up, when I was a kid, and I remember just thinking this was the greatest family ever, and they were super funny, and it didn't feel like other older comedies because it felt like it was, in some ways, it was kind of progressive and pushed forward things. She wasn't the typical housewife. He wasn't the typical bring home the bread kind of guy, and the show's sort of sprinkled with some of those old notions, but it also does a pretty good job of kind of breaking free from all of that. I feel like I noticed that somehow back in the day.
One thing about I can't say that I noticed it back in the day necessarily. Maybe subconsciously I did, but watching this pilot episode, or rather, we'll get to this. It's actually the second episode was the first of the Dick Van Dyke Show to air. The one that's called what is it? The Sick Boy and the Sitter.
Sick Boy and the Sitter.
I think I liked to see that. When we sometimes talk about older things that are older books, older TV shows, whatever, we say, well, it was of its time. Mm-hmm. You kind of have to see it through that lens, and some things they say we wouldn't say now. But what I liked is they were of their time, but challenging that time quite often.
Sure.
Dick Van Dyke would say the thing that was like, well, we wouldn't really say that anymore. And Mary would challenge him, and then he would go like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. You're right, essentially. And it wasn't heavy, but I liked it.
Yeah, I did too. There was something about that. And so jump to current. My kids, my two youngest, who are not that young anymore, one's 19, one's 22, they for some reason have a really great affinity for the show and have watched it. I don't know. I think Carter told me 6 or 7 times all the way through. Wow. The only episode she doesn't like is this alternate pilot, or this pilot that everything changed after that pilot. So for her, it's a little bit like The Cage, like from Star Trek. She's not really into it.
Oh yeah, very, very similar.
But
we should give people the rundown. Dick Van Dyke Show premiered October 3rd, 1961, with The Sick Boy and the Sitter. Ran through 1966 with Dick Van Dyke in the role of Rob Petrie and Mary Tyler Moore as Laura Petrie. Had Maury Amsterdam, had Rosemary, all-star cast. But that was not the pilot. This is the autopilot version of Current Geek. So we have to acknowledge that a show called Head of the Family aired on CBS July 19th, 1960, more than a year before the premiere of the Dick Van Dyke Show. It was not called the Dick Van Dyke Show because it didn't have Dick Van Dyke in it. Instead, the writer and producer of the Dick Van Dyke Show, Carl Reiner, played Rob Petrie and actually called himself Robbie Petrie. Yep. Laura Petrie was played by Barbara Britton. Buddy, who was the Maury Amsterdam character, was played by Morty Gunty. Sally Rogers was later played by Rosemary, was played by Sylvia Miles. Little Richie was played by Gary Morgan. And Alan Sturdy was the name of the host of the fictional show within a show, not Alan Brady. And Alan Sturdy was played by Jack Wakefield, although his face, just like the early seasons of Dick Van Dyke Show, the face of Alan Sturdy was never fully seen.
Yep, the obscure.
Carl Reiner, of course, goes on to play Alan Brady in the Dick Van Dyke Show. And the pilot was not successful. That led Reiner to rework the show, recast everyone, changed the pronunciation of Robbie Petrie to Rob Petrie. And then, of course, we got the actual Dick Van Dyke Show that had premiered on October 3rd, 1961.
I see. I didn't know any of this. So this was all news to me. Tom was the one that informed me. He says, hey, by the way, did you know there was this other alternate pilot? And then you started sending me links, and then the rabbit hole was opened, and then we started to go down that rabbit hole. And it turns out, of all the pilots we've ever covered, this one just has a really interesting story. You know, it's not just straight what you think it is. It's not the people you thought they were. They are other actors playing these roles, and it's freaky to see. Kind of really threw me. But I actually think some of the jokes. It was
weird to see Alan Brady playing Robbie Petrie.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And Carl Reiner, who created the show. You know, you always, or as I got older, I knew more about what that meant, like who writes shows and who creates shows and runs shows and that sort of thing, and started to appreciate him for who he was. But yeah, when you're younger, it's just, no, he's the guy that Rob Petrie writes for, and then to see him in this role, it's just freaking weird. And hear him called Rob or Robbie, and to see a completely different wife and a completely different kid and a totally different apartment, by the way.
Yeah,
all of that stuff changed, and also their audio on that original pilot's not great, but
that may be partly due to the fact that it was an unpicked up pilot. They may not have preserved it properly.
Sure.
Who knows what kind of copy we've got of this. It is available on Hulu though, in the Dick Van Dyke Show collection. You go and it says episode 1, and it's Head of the Family, which is kind of, if you were to start watching the Dick Van Dyke Show and watched a whole episode of something that didn't have Dick Van Dyke in it, you might be like, why would I watch this? This is weird.
Yeah.
This episode is not that great either. It's not horrible, but comparing it side by side, it just doesn't, like, you get why, like, oh yeah, no, you needed to rework this.
Not only that, but the people they ended up getting in there were just better for the material. And you and I talked about this the other day. It's not like the people they hired for the initial pilot were bad actors. They were all considered pretty great in their day. It's just, it wasn't right. They just weren't the right people.
Sylvia Miles is a great example of that. Sylvia Miles is a great actor.
Right.
She was not right for Sally.
Yeah.
Rosemary, I mean, part of that maybe because we were so familiar with the show that we can't imagine anyone else being Sally but Rosemary.
Right.
But it just, like, Sylvia Miles, as good as she was, just wasn't right for that part to me.
Right. Yeah. So and as far as I'm concerned, Maury Amsterdam is the reason you ever go to Rob's office. It's the reason you ever have those people come home with him. Like, he's such a part of the show that I can't picture anyone else. And that other guy just looked like, I don't know. He reminded me of that dude from SNL that does the Portlandia show. I can't think of his name. Fred Armisen.
Fred Armisen.
Yeah, he looks a lot like him.
Did have a little Fred Armisen look to him.
Well,
it was an entirely different character. Morty Gunty's buddy Sorrel was kind of a, thin, frail, things are always going to go wrong for me, neurotic kind of wreck. And Maury Amsterdam's buddy Sorrel is, quick talking, always with a joke, ready to make fun of anybody bald like Mel or Alan Brady. I mean, and there is no Mel Cooley in this pilot, by the way.
No Mel.
That's another difference between the two. But yeah, I mean, Buddy is opposite ends of the spectrum between these two.
It's really interesting. So I have actually a couple of clips, and this will blow some people away to hear this voice. But here's the original mom and the original kid talking in the kitchen, and you can just hear how different it is.
Writing the Alan Sturdy Show is a real job. Your father is a very important man. You've seen how Daddy types on the typewriter.
Well, Roy's sister could type on a typewriter, and she's a skinny girl. And Daddy never plays baseball with me.
So, totally different, like, tone. I don't know. It's a very odd thing to witness when you've seen that show multiple times.
Yeah. I have to say, Barbara Britton made an interesting Laura. I don't know that, it's so hard to not imagine Mary Tyler Moore becoming Mary Tyler Moore by doing this part, but Barbara Britton's Laura was acceptable to me. It was probably the only character in here. Well, maybe Carl Reiner's Robbie, totally different as well, but
different.
Maybe
but,
that could work.
Yeah, maybe you could flesh that out, and he.
Barbara
could be
Britton was the one where I looked at him like, okay, that's a good Laura.
Yeah,
I'm sure she would have grown with the part. But then again, how could we not get Mary Tyler Moore?
Oh, I totally agree. She's a freaking national treasure,
and all that she did after that.
Yeah, and the thing I really like about her Mary Tyler Moore, is that she had again this breakthrough ability to inhabit two eras. She was the housewife with the perfect dress and dinner ready at 5 and taking care of the kid and all the, just the stereotypes. Those were there, but there was something else to her. And Rob didn't rule the roost. He didn't come home and command much authority. When he did try to, it often blew up in his face because he would realize, oh man, we're more of a team. I can't do this. That sort of thing.
Yeah,
That's a
the
thread
sit
through
boy
the
and
whole
the sitter
show.
sets that tone right there.
Absolutely.
At the beginning, where he's like, come on, we have to go to this party. It'll be good for my career. And she doesn't just fold up and say, okay, Rob, whatever you want.
Yeah.
She's like, no, I'm not even going to go. I'm going to cook this liver. That's what we need to do.
I would argue that it is a really stereotype smashing kind of role without being so obvious and in your face that it annoys you. It's just
maybe smashing is too hard of a word, but it is it probably doesn't get enough credit for shining a light on those stereotypes. I think.
And certainly she got a lot of credit later when the Mary Tyler Moore
Mary
show
Tyler
broke
Moore
a lot of
show,
those
yeah,
ceilings
absolutely.
as well. But here's another clip. This is Carl Reiner talking as the character Robbie.
What's this all about, honey?
We have to have a serious talk about you and your son.
Can we save that for after dinner, darling? I've had a hard day.
Just a weird voice to hear as someone who's
Oh, it's
supposed
just
to be
so
Rob
weird to see
Petrie.
Alan Brady being Rob. It's almost nightmarish in a way. It took me a while to get used to that because Alan Brady, if you don't know anything about the Dick Van Dyke Show, you might still know about Alan Brady. Like his character was pervasive in TV lore for decades. I think it's kind of fizzled out now. You don't have as many people referencing him, but Alan Brady, Carl Reiner playing Alan Brady made a cameo appearance on Mad About You in the 90s.
Yeah.
As Alan Brady.
Yeah, that thing had what's the reach is the word I'm looking for. I don't think anybody even knows about it now, but at the time, it was kind of like
it's finally faded. But yeah, I mean that Alan Brady character is just bigger than life. The last time we've seen Carl Reiner as Alan Brady was in this weird animated show that TV Land tried. Did you look that up at all?
No, I didn't even know.
They tried to do the Alan Brady show, like the show within a show as an animated thing, but they were also showing you the people making the show. And it was that weird 3D animation of the mid 2000s that is really uncanny valley where the eyes don't move properly with the rest of the body. And they all kind of seem like they float when they move instead of just smooth movements. It was really weird. There's a trailer, actually quite a bit of an excerpt of it on Vimeo that I found.
But that was actually, they used Carl Reiner for that? He was on board?
Yeah, he voiced it.
Oh, interesting.
And Dick Van Dyke voiced one of the characters. Not Rob Petrie. They had different characters, kind of more modern characters. This is really, really weird. But yeah, just so seeing Carl Reiner trying to play the writer, it's like it just throws off all the chemistry because you don't have. I think one of the reasons that you can make Buddy Sorrell be the strong character that Maury Amsterdam plays is because Dick Van Dyke brought the neurosis to Rob,
right?
And sort of became like, I'm the head writer, but I have doubts about my abilities, but I'm still talented and I need my friends and I need my family to support me to make it. That just works so much better. It's so much more heartwarming than this sort of like, my boy doesn't love me because I don't play baseball with him. Well, I'll teach him. I'll write a poem for the school and that'll show him. It was so disconnected. It didn't have a center the way the actual Dick Van Dyke show.
I agree. Some of the gags are okay. Here's an example. I thought this was decent. And again, it's in the context of sort of the era of jokes, but at one point he says this.
You like me, don't you? See, and you got great taste.
Just some fun offhand jokes are used, but the thematic elements overall and the character arcs don't work. It's almost the kind of thing I would have expected this to die. Like, this is not a good pilot. That pilot isn't. The other one we watched, I think, is. That is to say, what is the second episode on Hulu, and it's enough that I would think that maybe this would have died on the vine. Nobody would have pushed to make the show anymore. And I would love to learn more about him pushing to make it better. Were the studios like, or was the studio or the network like, oh, yeah, you know what, let's do it, but let's just work it. Let's maybe talk about other cast. Like, how hard was that to push through? I'm always interested in that end of the story because as a standalone pilot, this feels like the end of a thing that never would have gotten off the ground. And instead, we ended up getting one of the most memorable and influential comedies in television history, which is just insane to me, you know?
I mean, I think that line you played is sort of emblematic. It's one of the funniest lines of that pilot.
Yeah.
And it would have been an unmemorable throwaway line in the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Yep, totally agree.
And Dick Van Dyke would have delivered it in a comic way, like, you know, well, you like me and you have great taste. Whereas Carl Reiner delivers it as sort of like, here's the big line. You know, it's so emblematic of the difference. And I'm glad they gave Carl Reiner a chance to re-engineer it. One thing I couldn't find an answer to was why they called it the Dick Van Dyke Show. Yeah. Instead of calling it Head of the Family. You know, they could have just kept that name, Head of the Family, or something.
He must have been a bigger deal then than we know about, or something, because isn't that the only time you give the show the name of the actor playing the role, like Bob Newhart or somebody like that? It's because they're known. Seinfeld's another one. It's like Jerry Seinfeld. It's got his name right in it. It's usually because they have some notoriety.
He had been around. He had been working, and he'd been a featured player on a lot of TV shows. So I suppose he had enough of a name that people were like, "Oh, Dick Van Dyke got his own show." Well, that's cool. But he was a bigger name after the Dick Van Dyke Show than he was before that. I guess he'd been in Mary Poppins. Maybe that was
happening
enough.
at the same time, right? Right around the pilot.
Oh, you know what? And he had been in Bye Bye Birdie. So Bye Bye Birdie in 1963, Mary Poppins in 1964. I guess. But both of those are after the start of the Dick Van Dyke Show in 1961.
Yeah, that just is so weird to me. You're
so
right.
He was a recurring sketch actor on the Ed Sullivan Show. He'd been in Alfred Hitchcock's Presents. He'd been a recurring character on the Phil Silvers Show in 1957 and 1958. But before the beginning of the Dick Van Dyke Show, he hasn't had his breakouts. It's after the Dick Van Dyke Show that he gets Mary Poppins and Bye Bye Birdie.
That's pretty interesting, because the other comparison I would use is era specific, which is the Andy Griffith Show, where his name is Andy Griffith in the real world, but on the show it's Andy Taylor. In this show, it's Rob Petrie, not Dick Van Dyke.
Yeah,
so to me, they're very comparable. The difference is Andy Griffith is a bit more like the Seinfeld example. He was known for stage and comedy, and then got a show that was folksy and kind of in his vein of comedy, just like Jerry, got a show about nothing, which is kind of what his stand-up's about. And the Dick Van Dyke example just isn't the same, and I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, it worked because we all think of it and we see him as iconic and his name's all over it. But you're right. Normally it's given to somebody with a name that's known for a whole lot more than just a couple of breakout things that actually haven't even happened yet. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's so weird too, because this is a Carl Reiner production.
Right.
It's Carl Reiner writing about his experiences writing on the Show of Shows, which is another show we should actually do on autopilot one of these days.
Yeah.
And working with Sid Caesar. Alan Brady is sort of loosely based on Sid Caesar and Milton Berle. And so you'd think it would be the Carl Reiner show, right? But it's not.
Yeah, it's very odd. Speaking of Buddy and Sally, there's some more audio of the actors who were not chosen. And this is, you're right, Buddy's very neurotic in this. So here's a taste.
I ordered you a lady with 5 sugars. How can you drink that stuff? 5 sugars? Ugh.
I told you I have a fluctuating metabolism and a hyperactive thyroid. I need a lot of sugar.
I mean, he was almost kind of going, I can't think of his name. Jerry's kids. Jerry
Lewis.
Jerry Lewis. He had kind of a Jerry Lewis neurosis thing happening that is just not present in Maury Amsterdam's portrayal of that character. It goes away as soon as Maury Amsterdam comes on the show. So that whole lay down on the couch, I have a headache, I need sugar, I've got a weird thyroid, that stuff goes away, and it's no longer part of the show.
Oh, it's not. It doesn't even go away. It's just never there.
Yeah, it's just not there. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, maybe these characters are more accurate to the experience he had when he worked on Show of Shows, Maybe what we got was such a different cartoonified thing. In some ways, that's a shame, because he doesn't get to express the actual thing, but the show is better for them going a different direction, and I'm glad they did, because the rest of the show is just straight up enjoyable from top to bottom, and it's one of those few comedies where they don't stay too long, they don't overstay their welcome, It runs just about as long as it should. It ends wonderfully. It's always in black and white. It's never in color, except for that weird thing you found. We'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, like they
did some colorized versions later on.
Yeah, but they didn't.
It was only aired in black and white.
That's correct, and it always felt, it always just felt like the perfect little encapsulated run of a show. And I admire that. I like it. I like when shows don't overstay their welcome. Andy Griffith's an example of one that's overstayed its welcome. It was there too long. And there's other shows like that. Beverly Hillbillies stayed on the air too long. There's a few shows like that. And that's how it used to be. They were always pushing for these things just to stay. And this one didn't overstay its welcome. But you found a 2004 like reunion, not a reunion show where they all sat around on a couch talking about their time on Dick Van Dyke Show. They did an episode, right?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
They did the Dick Van Dyke Show revisited. It was hosted by Ray Romano, and it featured all the surviving members.
Yeah.
So Rosemary is playing Sally. The woman who played Millie, the next door neighbor, is there.
Yep.
Alan Brady, played by Carl Reiner, is there. Of course, Dick Van Dyke, Mary Tyler Moore, and it starts with Ray Romano coming out on the set that has been recreated of their original home. Mm-hmm. But the premise is that that Rob and Mary or Laura have moved to Manhattan. Mm-hmm. And Rob now works from home writing scripts, and Laura has a dance studio in their Manhattan apartment, which I'm like, wow, they must have some Manhattan apartment to fit a dance studio in it. Like that's a little insane, but okay.
Yeah.
Guess they did well.
Yeah.
And so it opens with Laura teaching dance to kids, and then it's an episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show. He gets a call from Alan Brady. Alan Brady wants him to write his eulogy so that he can approve it before he dies. Yeah. And the hilarity ensues, and Dick Van Dyke's brother shows up. Dick Van Dyke's brother showed up on the original series as well, and he shows up and starts to have Millie as his love interest because Millie's husband has passed away. They mention Mel, and they mention Mel's funeral. They mention Buddy's funeral as eulogies that Rob gave that are the basis for why Alan wants him to give that. And then Sally is happily married. Mm-hmm. She and her husband, they have a new actor playing her husband, come over, and they all end up at Alan Brady's house. And what they did that I thought was really interesting is the very last scene of this Dick Van Dyke Show Revisited is Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore coming out onto the recreation of the original set as Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore.
Oh, wow.
So they use that set because Richie has bought their house that they used to live in. And so you see like an adult Richie kind of show up at one point. But that last segment is them just kind of, that's where you get the reminiscing. And it's just the two of them talking about what it was like and how they feel about it as Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore. I thought that was
super cool.
Really well done because it gave you this sort of like, oh, it's so fun to see all these characters interact again and see what they're like now, all these, many years later. Mm-hmm. But you also got the sort of like, yeah, that was it. That was another time. And it was fun to reminisce. Thanks for being with us.
That's really cool. That's really cool. I'm a sucker for that stuff, even when it's not done as well. I like to see kind of where they are all now, and I have nostalgia for that. I'm going to have to watch it. I didn't even know it existed, and Tom texted it, and I still missed it, but I'm going to watch it and see what I can do with it. Now, here's the funny thing. You talked about Millie. She's not in this episode, but Millie and her husband are a big part of the show moving forward as neighbors, and she's a great actress. Her name was Morgan Gilbert. I say was. She just passed away at age 87 in 2016, just a couple of years ago. Most recently,
and we just lost Mary Tyler Moore in 2018.
Yeah, it's been real close together that those two passed away. In her last bit was the TV show Life in Pieces, which is fantastic. She played Gigi, which is she plays a grandmother in the story. She's fantastic, and she's been on everything in modern stuff like Grey's Anatomy, Modern Family. Oh my gosh, tons of stuff. She was a great character on Seinfeld, another show I just mentioned. You just see her pop up in everything, and she had an amazing run, like an incredibly great career from like 61 forward. And I just wanted to call her out because she was great and
Oh, you're gonna
funny.
love seeing her in Dick Van Dyke Revisited. Then.
Oh, I'll bet. Yeah, she's in The Nanny too, which isn't a show I love, but I loved her role in The Nanny. She was great in that. She was in Grumpy Old Men, or Grumpier. I forget which one. She's just a great voice, great actress who, always kind of played a secondary character. Never really had a role of her own that was, the headliner or whatever. But I always admire that, and she was one of those people. So I guess rest in peace.
Now, there was another revisiting of the Dick Van Dyke Show. This is one of the things I find really interesting about the Dick Van Dyke Show is they did a 1979 episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Hour with Dick Van Dyke as their guest. The Mary Tyler Moore Hour sort of picked up after the Mary Tyler Moore Show went off the air. This is when Lou Grant came on as its own show without Mary Tyler Moore. And the Mary Tyler Moore Hour was sort of a fictional Mary does a variety show, but it shows them preparing for the variety show or imagining what the segments should be like in the variety show or watching the variety show that you never really see. So this episode starts with her in her house watching her singing on the variety show, which I assume we've never seen before. And the plot for Mary Tyler Moore is that there are fires, and some things never change. There are fires in Los Angeles, and she might have to leave her house to evacuate. Meanwhile, Dick Van Dyke is in at the production office, and they're trying to come up with a segment for him. And in the course of brainstorming what he could do on Mary's, and she's called Mary McKinnon, by the way, in this fictional Mary Tyler Moore Hour, which is, again, that weird thing where it's called after her, but she's not called that in the thing.
Sure.
And so they make a joke about how Mary McKinnon had auditioned for a role on the Dick Van Dyke Show, but didn't get it. And then they say it was the role of Sally. And then Dick Van Dyke at an earlier point has made a comment. It's like, wow, she looks a lot like the woman they cast as my wife on the Dick Van Dyke Show. And then they do two kind of imagination segments where they're like, what if we did a Dick Van Dyke Show spoof? And one of them is him getting the call that Alan Brady has died. And he has to write the eulogy. So I'm like, okay, so they reused that in 2004. But the other one is taking place in 2019.
Oh, wow.
So this is 1979, and they're like, it's 40 years later, and you're in your 90s, and so there's all these jokes about being old and not being able to hear and all this stuff. Right. And the saddest part about that, watching that Mary Tyler Moore Hour sketch of Dick Van Dyke Show, was knowing that Mary didn't make it.
Nope. Yeah,
but Dick has and is still working and still making stuff.
Yeah, he's Dick Van Dyke. He's a machine. I don't know how he does it. That guy is 1,000 years old.
Well, that Mary Tyler Moore Hour show, they make a joke in the 2019 sketch of Dick Clark still being around, who's also gone.
Right.
But Dick Van Dyke is the real Dick Clark, where it's like, you at 93 years old, still making stuff, still out there appearing on Showtime shows and in pre-production for shows. Like,
he tap danced. He tap danced in that new Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins Returns, back in 2018.
I mean, okay, so this will tell you just how into it my daughter is. She'll kill me for telling this story, but she loves that show. And when we went to see that, she knew about the history that he was in the first one. She hadn't actually seen the first one, but she really likes Dick Van Dyke. And when he got up and danced, she bawled in the movie theater, just cried, got all worked up over it. And that's pretty sweet. But yeah, he's amazing. Yeah, he's incredible, that guy. And he's still really, really sharp.
This show has had so many spinoffs. I mentioned the Mad About You. I mentioned the Mary Tyler Moore Hour. I mentioned the weird TV Land thing. There was also an appearance of Buddy and Sally on Herman's Head.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Yeah.
I remember Herman's Head. I have a memory of that.
The mid-90s show. The premise of Herman's Head was that there were people inside Herman's head that you saw kind of acting out what Herman was thinking. And at one point they need Herman to make some jokes. So they bring in Buddy and Sally from the Dick Van Dyke Show. Wow. And it's really them. It's really Maury Amsterdam and Rosemary doing that. This is a show that has not shied away from revisiting itself. And is honored by other shows like Mad About You and Herman's Head, and almost got canceled in its first season. CBS wasn't going to renew it.
Happens every time. Every show that goes on to be legendary, they almost get canceled the first season. It's crazy to me. Seinfeld almost canceled. Cheers almost canceled. Like the biggest comedies you can think of, all of them almost canceled, and then boom, somebody
But
gave
the
it a
weird thing
chance.
about Dick Van Dyke Show is, you know who saved it?
Who?
Shampoo.
Oh.
Procter and Gamble threatened to pull its advertising from the network's daytime lineup
Wow,
if they didn't renew the Dick Van Dyke Show.
that's crazy.
What kind of stuff did Dick Van Dyke have on the Procter and Gamble execs?
No
Oh my gosh.
kidding. They were putting well, apparently they were putting long life serum in there because he's never going to die, and he has a full head of hair. But
He's obviously, made some kind of deal for his soul. There's a picture of Dick Van Dyke or something somewhere. Who knows?
I never, but kind of bums me out. I never watched any of those. What was that thing he was a doctor in? Oh, I forgot the name of it. It was like
Dick Van Dyke was a doctor?
Yeah, and he's a lot older. This is like 80s, I think, and it was called
Diagnosis Murder.
Diagnosis Murder. It was kind of like what's her name's Bed Knobs and Broomsticks lady's show. Murder She Wrote. It's a little bit like that. And
well, okay, I know I'm interrupting you, but the most recent thing that you can watch that Dick Van Dyke did was Buttons, a musical film with Murder, She Wrote with Angela Lansbury.
Oh, no way. That's too funny.
Yeah.
And that was just that's last year.
2018.
Yeah. Then he did the Returns thing. He did I guess they're crediting him for that colorized stuff you were talking about.
Yeah, that was only a couple of years ago. He's got an appearance in an episode of Kidding from Showtime that's coming up in 2020, and he's in pre-production on something called Capture the Flag.
Listen to this. Here's
your group
description.
of elderly vets engage in a spirited game of Capture the Flag. That'll be fun.
That sounds great. I'm in. I like it when old people do things. I mean, maybe he'll do that with. I'm actually going to check it. Nope, he's not.
Louis Gossett Jr., Barry Corbin, John Amos, and Paul Dooley are all listed as cast.
I'm all in on that. Whatever that is, that sounds dumb and great. I am super into it. So I'm a sucker for like.
Louis Gossett Jr. has been pretty good on Watchmen.
Oh, he's great on Watchmen. Yeah. In fact, I double took on that thing. I went, oh my gosh, that's Louis Gossett Jr. And this is the best work he's done since like, what was that? He got an Oscar for something forever ago. It's really good. He's great on that show. If you guys haven't been watching Watchmen, you should probably watch The Watchmen, because who watches The Watchmen? We do. That's who does. Also, I love Barry Corbin, so any chance to pull that dude out. But I was going to say, you could put Carl Reiner in there, because he's still kicking it. In fact, I guess him and, can't think of his name, famous comedian, been around forever, made a bunch of movies, Young Frankenstein, Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks still hang out all the time. They get together on Friday nights. Their wives have long passed, so they're just kind of buddies. And there was an episode.
I wonder where they get together. I want to go hang out.
I want to totally do that. But they had an episode of Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee with Seinfeld, and he went to one of their houses, and they were in there laughing at some movie, and he just got to sit there and hang with these two guys.
Oh my gosh, that's so
Can
special.
you imagine that? That would just be unfreaking believable. Because they're just legends, and I can't believe all those guys are living so long. Where did they? They were all smokers and stuff. What happened? How did this work out for them?
Were they though?
I think so.
I guess they were.
Weren't they all? I think everybody smoked then. They were all smoking, and everybody lived. Maybe it's all been a lie. Maybe those warnings mean nothing. Maybe I'm supposed to,
Well, I think it's not like smoking immediately kills you or 100% kills you. It just mostly kills you, and we're only seeing the people who lived because they were in the percentage that didn't die.
That's good.
Right?
That's true. Yeah.
There's plenty of examples of things going the other way.
You're not wrong. It's very good though, and I would recommend just sitting down and having it on, even if it's on in the background or something. That's a lot of what you'll find here at the house. And like I say, I think there's a whole generation of people who have streaming services who discover this stuff. They're young. Everyone thinks they're millennials and Gen Zs and don't have any interest in old stuff. But I have two living proofs. It's one of their favorite shows. They'll tell you that to your face. And there must be something to it if a 19-year-old in 2019 can find that much entertainment in a show this old. So yeah, watch it if you haven't. I loved watching this. I really had a good time. We didn't even talk really about the story bits of the second one. It's not even really that important. It's just, the party at the house and them getting all vaudevillian and all that stuff is so throughout the series. They do this all the time. And I don't know, it just really establishes the characters and you know what you're getting into. And that's pretty much the series. And it's always heartwarming and fun. And, the conflicts are not all that conflicting, and it's just a nice, entertaining
Well,
thing.
it's a little bit of a tip of the hat to vaudeville, the way shows today may do a tip of the hat to the Dick Van Dyke era, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's we're even farther from the Dick Van Dyke era now, but it's sort of like, we can still do entertainment the old way.
Yeah, it felt like a USO tribute.
Yeah, and he did USO stuff, so that makes sense.
Right. And there's a thread through the show later on where they do flashbacks of where he and Laura met, which were in World War II. That's the story. And they met because they both were in the USO, and they reenact a bunch of that stuff, and that's just fun to see. They have a very lighthearted view of World War II in this show, though. It's never taken too seriously. There's not a whole lot of war as hell going on. In fact, it seemed like a very entertaining war if you've only seen the Dick Van Dyke Show. But I'm fine with this kind of lighter fare. It's just good, good, clean American 1960s fun. So catch it. Available now on Hulu. And watch the weird pilot, too, because it's weird and worth seeing. It's like 20 minutes.
You can bail at any moment, but it's worth starting if you already know the show. I would recommend not watching it till you've learned to appreciate the actual Dick Van Dyke Show.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, the other thing I was going to bring up, the intro.
Yes.
He doesn't trip over the ottoman at all or sidestep it or any of that stuff yet. This is just like weird photo flashes and introduction of people's
No, they
names.
didn't really settle on an intro until later.
Yeah. And then,
in fact, apparently viewers would try to guess which intro they were going to see because they kept changing it.
Yeah, and I remember as a kid, this is so dumb. I remember as a kid, I would sit back on the couch, and when this intro would start where we were in the seasons where he either tripped or he moved out of the way. And I never knew which it was going to be. And I remember as a kid, I would say before the thing to my brother or my sister, I'd say, he's going to trip this time. And one of them would say,
yeah. No, that's what people would do back when it was new, too.
yeah,
That's
we'd
great.
take a bet, and then we would find out what would happen. And that was this dumb meta game we would play when we would watch this thing on reruns. So pretty good stuff. Anyway, we'd love to know your thoughts. What do you think of the Dick Van Dyke Show? And also, are you ready for what we're doing next month? And I don't know that we are. Are we? What's our thing? What are we doing for Autopilot? We haven't talked about it yet. We should come up with one.
Yeah. So the next time we do Current Geek, it will be our movie episode, Treasure of the Sierra Madre. So we do know that.
Right.
But for the next Autopilot, we could either dip into our top 98 shows of all time that I compiled from multiple lists, or we could dip into our suggestions that have been given to us by multiple people.
Mm-hmm.
The top of the top 98 is a more recent 2000s era show. A lot of our possibles are of the same era as Dick Van Dyke, or maybe even 70s, 80s.
Sure.
Do you have a preference on era?
Oh, era. I mean, maybe since we're now in the 60s, maybe we bump forward to something. I don't know. What do we have? What do we have in the 80s?
The top 80s show that is on our top 98 is Hill Street Blues.
Oh, we should totally do Hill Street Blues.
You want to do Hill Street Blues?
Yeah, because I found out the other day the hard way in a trivia contest I lost that Hill Street Blues was not one of the top 10 shows of the 80s in terms of ratings, Nielsen ratings.
In terms of ratings.
And I was sure it was. I knew it critically it was, but I was positive it was a bigger deal at night for everybody. And it was other things like, Dallas and stuff like,
everybody
Knots
talked
Landing.
about it.
Yes. It was one of those things. And that's an interesting discussion. When we do it now, even with streaming stuff, people freak out about a thing they fall in love with on Netflix or something. But it turns out if you knew the Netflix numbers, it's like one of their lowest things of the year. And is there room for that? And I don't know. There's a lot we could talk about on the periphery of that. But I would like to do that just because it's been forever. That's a botch code joint. That there's a lot to talk about there. So yes, I think Hill Street
The good
Blues.
news is that is available on Hulu.
Nice.
Seasons.
Hulu, streaming all the things we need lately.
All the things we need. No, well done, Hulu.
Not bad.
Nice job.
I used to think
if
Hulu
you want to
was
acquire
going
the
away.
show, talk to us.
Yeah. Yeah, let us know. We're available.
Everybody's doing podcasts these days,
Yeah,
Come
it's
on.
the hot new thing. It's back, I heard. I hear it's back. What else? Don't leave yet, though, because when we're done here, Legal Geek swoops in this week and talks about the latest patent filings on television tech, including foldable TVs we may see in a future Black Friday deal. Or otherwise available at some store. So do check that out. This is an important announcement. On the 31st, we'll be doing a live show, Tom and I, for charity. So we'll be doing this show, or a version of it.
We'll be doing our discussion show.
Yeah, our discussion show, exactly.
Yeah.
But we'll do it live on Twitch. We'll be a part of a greater effort to earn money for the Extra Life Kids Foundation.
We'll do it live.
Yeah, and we'll do it live. So doing it for the kids, doing it live. And you guys should check that out. That'll be on the 31st. We believe we're starting. I think we said something like 4 p.m. Mountain, but we'll let you guys know as we get closer.
It's on the half hour because we want to be able to count down to someone's new year in the middle of the show.
Right. That's cool. Oh, who do you want to do? What country do you want?
Well, it's whatever. We should. What is our? We should have prepared for this tease better. Twitch.tv/frogpants and twitch.tv/ritualmisery will be the places that you can find us.
Yeah.
It looks like we are doing 3:30 p.m. Pacific, 4:30 Mountain.
All right.
So if you give me a sec,
I like this. Let's do the
figure
math.
it out,
Yeah, let's do
I
the
can
math.
tell you what 4 Pacific will be, where 4 Pacific December 31st will be at midnight.
I want like Armenia or something weird. I want like a...
Yeah, because right now it's 4:48 in LA.
Yeah.
So the midnight will be. Oh, it'll be the countdown to London.
Oh, that's cool. That's a big one.
It's the countdown to UTC.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. No, that's great. Boom. We can even at the tone. The time would be. Oh, we can go full British. No, that'll be great. I'm excited about that now. I thought we'd get some little podunker, but we got one of the big cities in Europe.
Greenwich Mean Time.
So anyway, that'll be up on the 31st or happening on the 31st. More details as we get closer. Follow us on Twitter at Current Geek to learn more. And as always, we're at currentgeek.com. Tom, do you have anything going on this week you want people to be aware of?
Yeah, I have a writing Patreon. If you want sneak peeks as I leak out chapters of my book Vera, or occasional excerpts of The Girl at the Bottom of the Lake, which is the NaNoWriMo that I did this year, just free writing from me, fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, mostly sci-fi, to be honest. You can be a patron of my writing at patreon.com/acedetect.
Ah, very nice.
ACEDTECT.
Very nice. If you also like this show and you want to support it, we also have a Patreon, patreon.com/currentgeek. You can use it as frequently as you like. We got great rewards on there, and we appreciate everybody who already has. If you haven't, consider it. That's over at patreon.com/currentgeek. Like I mentioned before, currentgeek.com for just about everything else. I'm on Twitter at Scott Johnson. You can find Tom at Ace Detect. You can find the show at Current Geek. That's going to do it for us. For me, for Tom, for all of you. We'll see you next time. We did it.
We got there.
Yeah. Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
the show, the